Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're closing in on day 100 of the Trump administration. With us to talk about it, France 24 White House correspondent Philip Crowther, Fernando Espuelas, journalist and commentator who's also in the U.S. Capitol, as is Pedro de Costas, a reporter for Business Insider, and Scotty Nell Hughes, a political strategist and commentator. Welcome back to all four of you. On day 97, the Trump administration unveiling a tax reform, that I believe Pedro called as a tax briefing. Is that the words you used?
I called it an outline, which is really what it was.
An outline, right. In any case, a sneak peek. They talked about just 3 tax brackets, the highest one reduced to 35% of income. If you're watching from elsewhere around the world and you're asking, why does this concern me? Well, in 2015, public debt represented the equivalent of 126% of the United States' GDP. Now, that's one of the highest levels among OECD nations. It's even more than France. The amount of debt, by the way, has gone up. It's gone up in spurts the past 2 decades. Again, this is if you do a ratio compared to GDP, it went up once. You see during the Iraq War, and much, much more when there was stimulus after the financial crisis. Fernando Espuelas, the Trump administration has promised big spending on infrastructure. It's promising big tax cuts. What's going to happen now to the U.S. debt?
Well, the tax cuts, and Pedro, I think, called it the right thing, and to outline bullet points, should they be enacted into law, which no one really believes that's the case, would blow up the national debt in a very dramatic fashion. What we have here is, once again, trickle-down economics. It was tried several times under Republican administrations, the premise being that if you cut taxes, somehow economic activity will replace the revenue for the federal government. That has never proven to be true. So that's going to be a hard sell to specifically fiscally conservative Republicans who are fighting, have been fighting for a long time to cut the debt. So I think that particular element of Trump's program will move forward because there's a lot of interest, but it's very unclear what the outcome will be. In terms of infrastructure, the promise was that I believe that in the first few days of the administration, he would sign the biggest, best, hugest infrastructure bill known to mankind, but it hasn't even been presented to Congress. There's no outline that I'm aware of. Certainly that's something that now sounds like it's going to be pushed off to another year. So in terms of the big elements of his agenda, healthcare, as we discussed, has been stopped, at least for now. The tax cuts, maybe, perhaps, sometime later this year, but no one knows. And infrastructure is not even on the agenda, at least right now.
It's Scotty Nell Hughes. I'm seeing that this is something that's really dividing the Republican Party between those who want the tax cuts and those who are saying, are the so-called fiscal hawks, who are saying, watch out, we gotta keep an eye on the deficit. If you personally had to choose between the infrastructure spending and the tax cuts, which would you choose?
Well, at this point, I think you can have a little bit of both to a certain extent. And this is one thing I think we can all agree on, is that there is a divide right now amongst the Republican Party. There is a large group, and I am one of those who believe that trickle-down economics underneath Ronald Reagan did work, did help save us from the devastating economic policies of Jimmy Carter and able to bring us back from a recession, and truly did bring us back. But there are those Republicans who are still in office that are the ones that were the tax and spend Republicans that gave us the crisis of 2008. And those gentlemen and ladies are still there and still want to be able to continue to spend like we have an unlimited budget, which we obviously do not have anymore with $19 trillion in debt. But I do believe we have infrastructure, but I believe that there's a responsible way of doing infrastructure planning, and I think that's what the president is looking for right now. And I guess it's so simple, it's complicated for some on the other side to actually agree that this tax policy is actually a good thing that President Trump put out.
Pedro da Costa, your thoughts?
But there's absolutely no, if I may respond to that, there's absolutely no proof that cutting revenues somehow results in increasing revenues. That the Laffer curve, all of that stuff has been proven to be incorrect several times, and especially part of the reason why the debt blew up, doubled under President Bush, is because taxes were cut, revenues were cut, and the growth did not come. The slowest period of economic growth and employment growth in the last 50 years, as Pedro will know much better than I, but was during that period where they experimented once again with drastic cuts to taxes to the wealthiest people. So there's absolutely no proof this strategy will work again magically. There's nothing, math doesn't change that way.
So you're saying the Bush years were worse than the Carter years?
Wait,
but you're saying that the Bush years were worse than the Carter years?
What you're saying is
I'm sorry,
so
I wasn't even
irrelevant.
alive during that, and I know that's not true. No, it's very much true.
You have no idea what you're talking about.
But you're saying that it wasn't that trickle-down economics.
All right. You don't even have the facts.
Condescending.
You don't have the facts.
Pedro da Costa, let me ask you about this.
Obviously, you don't either.
Pedro da Costa, let me ask you about this, because we have a presidential election coming up in this country, and open or closed borders, trade, it's the heart of the issue during the runoff race in this French presidential election. We can't help but notice that Donald Trump has issues these days, both with Mexico and now with Canada, when it comes to trade and the free trade agreement they have there. Where is it going?
Okay, so let me first address the previous issue, which I wanted to speak about. And to Fernando's point, yes, we had the trickle-down economics plan under George W. Bush. Not only did it lead to the famous jobless recovery, it also preceded the worst economic crisis in our lifetimes and the Great Recession that followed. So there was a whole period of bubbling deregulation and financialization and blowing up of bank activity under that administration and under that philosophy of letting the markets run themselves that led us into the pits in the first place, that President Obama then had to try to drag us back out of that hole. And he did so haltingly.
And on trade?
So that's point number one. That's point number one. To the immigration point, just as Mexican immigration is a very minor factor in the U.S. labor market, and therefore the fact that Trump uses it so often shows that it's really a xenophobic smokescreen in a way to rally his base rather than sound economic policy. And it really does mirror the whole pitch that Marie Le Pen makes, that France would somehow be better off without Europe. It's lunacy that France, it's obvious after Brexit, when you look at the loss of power that Britain has had, it just becomes so obvious to the world that a united Europe is stronger than a divided Europe, and then all these little islands of power. And so,
but on the issue, Pedro, on the issue of trade, let me ask you, because it's now both Mexico and Canada with which Donald Trump is conversing.
Yeah, so that's it's really an economic policy that we haven't seen in the United States since really the 19th century, even before that. It's a mercantilist, protectionist policy that attacks your neighbors that you have supply chain relationships with. It affects our firms adversely because we have exporters that have relationships with those importing firms. He's talking about a border adjustment tax that's equally protectionist and problematic and has raised all sorts of eyebrows and has led even the businesses that support him to lobby against it. And so his trade policy is backwards, and if fully implemented, now the saving grace is that it's goofy at the same time. He's gone back on his position on NAFTA. He went from saying that he was going to pull out on day one and name China a currency manipulator on day one. He's done neither. Now he said he's going to stick to NAFTA. So it's a goofy policy, so that may save us from the worst outcome. But if fully implemented, it would certainly lead to a deep recession.
Philip Crowther, let me ask you. Trump has yet to go abroad. He's due to travel early next month. But let me ask you, of all the visits we've seen, and the first one was Theresa May, obviously. We had Angela Merkel. We just saw those images of Justin Trudeau at the White House. What's been the one that struck you the most?
Well, most of them pretty much went better than expected, if you will, because these were foreign leaders who were faced with this man who, frankly, almost none of them wanted to see elected. That is the simple truth. They might not have said it out loud, but that was the case. Let's just mention one straight off the bat, somebody who we would never have seen in the White House during the Obama administration. That's the president of Egypt, who Barack Obama would not have invited into the White House. He made it there. That is one sign of a new relationship between the United States and another country. I think the most important foreign visit, though, was not necessarily a foreign leader coming to the Oval Office. It was the Secretary of State Rex Tillerson going to Moscow. Now, that didn't involve President Donald Trump, but this was an incredibly important trip because it showed that the United States and Russia actually seemingly don't get along as well as a lot of the reporting during the transition and now during the early days of the Trump presidency seemed to show some kind of possible collusion between Russia and the United States. That is one of the big stories of the first 100 days of this Trump presidency that has been overshadowed by all of these sometimes rumors, sometimes very good reporting on the links that there have been between individuals in the Trump campaign and the transition team and individuals in the Russian intelligence services. In terms of the foreign visits, here's one thing you might remember. Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, alongside US President Donald Trump, and her quick glance over to him, completely misunderstanding or not really comprehending what really Donald Trump was saying. That was one moment where what looks like a veneer of very official visits somehow disappeared. This is a foreign leader who simply didn't understand what Donald Trump was saying at one particular point. But these visits are largely about showing that the countries can get along even though their leaders might not. I don't think there is any sign right now, for example, that Merkel and Trump are getting along very well or Trudeau and Trump are getting along particularly well. But we are looking at brand new relationships here potentially between the United States and some of its historical allies, possibly even some of its enemies. But those enemies that have always been there are still there. North Korea is the case in point. That is the foreign country that is being talked about the most right now here in Washington. Yeah, and you talked about Donald Trump, the change of tack when it comes, we were mentioning it earlier, the trade with China. We recall Xi Jinping's visit to his West Palm Beach resort, clearing the air on some issues. But it was during that visit that Trump sprang his biggest surprise, telling the Chinese leader during dinner that he'd order Tomahawk missile strikes on a Syrian air base purportedly used for a chemical weapons attack on civilians by the Assad regime. That caught his guest off guard. Even more off guard was Moscow, and it didn't stop there.
I said it was obsolete. It's no longer obsolete. It's my hope that NATO will take on an increased role in supporting our Iraqi partners in their battle against ISIS.
Scotty Nell Hughes, on the campaign trail, Trump often struck an isolationist tone. We're not going to pay for the rest of the world. The Japanese, the Koreans, the Europeans, they're going to have to pay for their own defense. Donald Trump, has he changed his tack now? Is the United States back to being more hawkish?
Well, he's always said he wants to put America first, but that also includes, he said that he was going to fight ISIS, and he wasn't just going to do it in a kindergarten childish way that the past administration did. He was actually going to take them out. So a lot of the decisions right now that are being made in foreign policy have to do with taking out ISIS as well as other radical jihadists and other radical Islamic groups. That being said, I think, to your previous question, that actually the visit with China was probably one of the most important we have seen, as now we're finding out that China is, we've always said, I think we can all agree,
before we talk about China, the Tomahawk missile strikes
diplomatically handle relations in North Korea.
The Tomahawk missile strikes, though, were against the Syrian regime, not against ISIS.
About what those. Not necessarily, but you have to understand, if you're going to look at it, the Trump was in reaction to the chemicals that supposedly Assad did on his own. If that's why you think President Trump did that, then I can see where you can come up with all sorts of excuses that he's gone back and we're in Syria. If we were in Syria, he would have actually laid a full bomb right on top of Assad's head and we would put boots on the ground. If we wanted to wipe it out, I know we could. That's not what President Trump was doing. He was sending a message not only to Assad, not only to North Korea, but to all of those evils that are existing in the world today, that the regimen has changed. There's a new person in town, and he's not just going to sit back and let things happen and let you get away. He's not leading from behind, which was the policy, the foreign policy of the President Obama's administration. He's actually going to be proactive, and he's going to have peace through strength, which is something he said all the time on the campaign trail.
Fernando Espuelas, when you look at the way Trump has conducted foreign policy. Has it surprised you?
Not really. I mean, during the campaign, it was very clear that he didn't have a lot of knowledge as to how foreign relations worked for the United States or the proper role of the United States. You opened up the segment with that funny, frankly, it's funny tape saying, I said NATO was obsolete, it's no longer obsolete. You know, I think anybody else who would say that, people would just laugh at them. But in this particular case, because I think what Pedro mentioned, which is like he's moving in the right direction, people are willing to accept it. So, no, I'm not surprised. I don't think there is a foreign policy. I think it's very tactically driven. So he sees pictures of dead babies, which unfortunately we've been seeing for many, many years, and then he reacts to it. It's not very clear that militarily that was an effective attack at all. Airplanes are reportedly to have flown out of that base the very next day. In terms of Korea, I think, you know, the best part of the Korea policy thus far, I think, is possibly getting China more engaged. But there's also a lot of embarrassment around it. He announced an armada, which is an unfortunate word anyway to use with your Navy. But anyway, an armada is going to Korea. In fact, it was going in the opposite direction. How do you lose an aircraft carrier? I think is a valid question. How can there be so much chaos at the core of the foreign policy establishment? And then, of course, we can't forget that the National Security Advisor, General Flynn, is now accused of having taken money from Russia and from Turkey while working on the campaign and then working as National Security Advisor. So there are a lot of squirrely things going on here. And I think that as the adults start to take over, as it seems is happening with Secretary Mattis at the Pentagon and General McMaster at the National Security Council, that perhaps there's going to be more of a strategic point of view towards our policy and not so tactical. But right now, it's very hard to say what a Trump doctrine would be.
All right, so
I think it's important that you mentioned the defense angle here, because I think one of the big things that Donald Trump has done during his coming up to the first 100 days is taking off the shackles, so to say, from the Pentagon. Because what this president saw with that attack on the Syrian regime while the Chinese President Xi Jinping was visiting him in Florida was that even a relatively small military action can be deemed a success by many. This is the moment that some commentators said President Trump became president of the United States. This is something that empowers a president, not necessarily something that I agree with, but it is something that people on both the left and the right of the political spectrum agreed with, and they liked what they saw from this president because of that military strength. That is something that Donald Trump has taken on board. He knows that military action can give him a good reputation, can give him a boost in his popularity. And that is why he's taken the shackles off the Pentagon. They are now taking decisions for themselves, the case in point being the biggest bomb, the biggest non-nuclear bomb ever dropped in the history of mankind in eastern Afghanistan. That was not a decision by Donald Trump per se. It was a decision taken by the Pentagon. That is a true impact that this president is having. That is a real change. I agree there's no big overarching foreign policy, but when it comes to how this presidency is dealing with its military power, that is a really significant change.
All right, so...
well, but if I could just quickly respond to that.
Sure.
But look what you're saying. You're saying that his greatest successes have come from breaking the civilian chain of command of our military. That by allowing the generals essentially to play an outsized role, which have not played, certainly not during peacetime, that somehow that's a better option. And what we're saying here is that something that was established since... Excuse me?
And absolving himself of liability in so doing.
Well, but the president has ultimate liability, right? I mean, you can't escape liability. You're the commander-in-chief. That's what the Constitution says. I mean, at the end of the day, I think we're giving him credit for essentially not making decisions or giving him credit for turning over power to the military. I mean, these are things that are not in the American model. These are things that should be worrisome to Americans who have an institutional point of view, who are not in Washington to bring down the institution of federal government, but rather who have a long-term view about America's positive role in the world.
Well, Scotty Now Hughes, the U.S. Constitution is something that's admired in a lot of places around the world because you have that balance of power between the legislative, the executive, the judiciary, and of course, civilians have the final say over the military. Do you feel that there is a danger that Donald Trump could overplay his hand by giving too much of a free rein to the military?
Well, first of all, thank you for being one of the first commentators or first hosts who've actually acknowledged that there's a fourth branch called We the People. So thank you for actually acknowledging that, because a lot of people forget about that point. And I think that right there is the reason why President Trump is always going to be held accountable, because he does not necessarily pay attention to those journalists or pundits on air. He pays attention to the people, not popularity polls, to the people. And when they want to say that these decisions are being made in the Pentagon without his knowledge, I have to object to that. Unless these gentlemen are in the room and actually can verify and make it a fact that President Trump did not know, that issue, as well as we're talking about some of the other stories that have been brought up that President Trump was not aware of, I think is actually completely wrong. There is not a single action going on within the Pentagon, especially on something as large as dropping the mother of all bombs, that the President of the United States did not have any knowledge of beforehand. That's absolutely ludicrous and insulting, not only to the President in the White House, but to the people who support him. And that's right now, I think, what we have to be careful as we're talking about. You're on the verge of your election here in France, that the more these pundits continue to insult either it be Le Pen or either of the candidates, they're also insulting their followers. And I think that's where this divide is coming up and is going to be harder to heal. And why we're having to have a harder time healing after the American elections was because these pundits don't realize that they're also insulting the supporters of their candidate when they're saying some of the things and some of the accusations that they're throwing out there right now.
All right, we're almost out of time. Philip Crowther, let me ask you.
This is a president who clearly does listen to pundits on television, though not necessarily the four of us right now. But I doubt there has ever been a president who watches television, then tweets about it, and potentially even creates policy out of what he sees on television and out of what he sees on his favorite shows. He says it himself. He consumes the media voraciously. He consumes cable news more than probably any president before him, and he makes decisions based on that. So that is something I'll have to disagree with you. This is a president who listens to the pundits on television. All right, Philip, I hope you can convince him to watch more France 24. I want to thank Scotty Nell Hughes for being with us from Nashville. I want to thank Fernando Espuelas and Pedro da Costa for being with us as well in Washington. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
There is a guilty pleasure, is there not? Every day, because of the time difference for us, it's around 2, 3 p.m. when we go over to Twitter and see what's on there.
Yes, absolutely. And not just Twitter, but all sorts of things that we take a look at when it comes to Media Watch, whether it's television programmes or other news outlets. We don't normally get much of our analysis from The Simpsons, from cartoon programmes in general. But of course, The Simpsons were, it's fair to say, I think, the first to predict the Trump presidency. Back in 2000, they came up with that in a particular episode. Now, what's come out today, been posted on YouTube by the Simpsons makers, is a taster of what's to come in Sunday's episode, when it will be seen in the US, of course. Let's take a look at what they've got to say.
I am not replacing him.
Don't wrinkle the suit! 100 days in office, so many accomplishments, lowered my golf handicap, my Twitter following increased by 700, and finally, we can shoot hibernating bears. My boys will love that.
Sir, here's a new bill that you must read immediately. It lowers taxes for only Republicans.
Can't Fox News read it? Now watch what they say.
No, you have to read it.
So that is the Simpsons' take on Donald Trump's first 100 days in office.
It's not entirely flattering.
Not at all flattering. It goes on to talk about Ivanka's become a Supreme Court judge in this episode. Marge, the wife in The Simpsons, has run out of Prozac, and she had a supply that was supposed to last her the full 4 years. And Homer Simpson says, give him time, he's only 70, as though he needs to gain a bit of experience. The Washington Post says it is a grim take on Trump's first 100 days, particularly grim, of course, with Sean Spicer having committed suicide in the press briefing room. And of course, you had Jared Kushner and Steve Bannon trying to strangle one another, which, of course, is allegedly what they're attempting to do actually in the White House. There is supposed to be quite a lot of disagreements between the two.